Hey there, Synergizers, and welcome back to another episode of the Creating Synergy podcast. My name is Daniel Franco, and today on the show, we have a really great man by the name of Daniel Gannon on the show. Daniel is one of South Australia's leading and most influential industry executives, an expert and strategic leader in membership-based organisations. Over the past 7 years, Daniel has spearheaded successful and historic campaigns to abolish commercial stamp duty, reform land tax, and defeat punitive taxes on CBD car parks and banks. Advocacy outcomes like these have increased South Australia's investment attractiveness, particularly in the state's property and real estate sectors. In 2020, Daniel was named one of South Australia's top 50 most influential people and top 10 real estate heavyweights, while in 2018, he was named one of South Australia's top 40 leaders under 40 and one of the state's top 50 Powerbrokers. Often accredited as one of the most strategic operators in South Australia, the 2020 list of Daniel says he is a forceful yet smooth operator. Throughout his career, Daniel has worked across local, state and federal government policy spheres and had embedded himself in membership-based organisations. He has also driven significant change in the property and investment industry as the South Australian Executive Director of the Property Council of Australia, now arguably the state's most powerful association. In this episode, Daniel shares his journey from growing up and living in a caravan with his family to how he dreamed of being an architect, to working in the family business in retirement villages, to taking on his former bosses Stephen Marshall and Rob Lucas in the battle to squash the land tax charges. Daniel was fierce in promoting South Australia and trying to attract people and business from all over the world to our great state. He shares his thoughts on what the workplace would look like moving forward and the types of impacts that people working from home will have on all industries. Daniel also speaks about the impacts of the pandemic in the market, from the landlord to the shop front, as well as providing us some statistics about how we're faring post-pandemic. If you love the episode, which I'm sure you will, be sure to hit subscribe button and check us out at SynergyIQ.com.au and SynergyIQ on all the social media outlets. Cheers. So welcome back to the Creating Synergy podcast. My name is Daniel Franco, your host, and today we have Daniel Gannon on the show. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
Executive Director of the Property Council.
Yeah, look, the Property Council, just for a bit of background for some of your listeners, we are a membership-based organisation, a not-for-profit company that represents landlords, basically. So we represent people who have skin in the game with commercial property, residential, industrial, and retirement living and retail. Now, that's a lot of things. Yeah. In really simple terms, we are different things to different people on different days, but we are property-focused.
Beautiful. Now, let's talk... Before we get into the full Property Council remit and everything that you guys do and are doing for the people of South Australia and Australia, I want to just rattle off a few statistics here, a few little, not statistics, a few little accolades of Mr. Daniel Gannon.
Where are we going?
So in 2018 was named one of the South Australia's most top 100 influential people, one of SA's top 40 leaders under 40, one of South Australia's top 50 Powerbrokers, and then recently one of the top 50 most influential people. It's a bit of a head wobble going on over there.
No, look, these lists, they are quite humbling. Yeah, they're a little bit embarrassing at times as well. But to be honest, my game at the Property Council is about currency. Yeah. It's about connectivity. It's about relationships. So what we do on any given day is our job is to convince politicians and decision makers at local, state and federal government levels to be really careful with legislation or policy making that has an impact on the property industry here in South Australia. So just to give you a bit of an economic context, property is South Australia's biggest private sector employer. It employs about 1 in 5 people in this state. It supplies a salary to 1 in 6 people here. It contributes almost 12% of GSP. So what that means for us is that when we do sit down with politicians, when we do sit down with decision makers to provide some very careful advice to them, we do so on behalf of the state's economy because the property industry plays a really important role within that economy. And if my job on occasion means carrying a level of influence to be able to do that, then that's okay with me. But it is a little bit embarrassing.
You kind of need to have that influence. 25%. If you're representing 25% of the people in the working jobs, I mean, you'd want to have a little bit of influence in your role.
Yeah, and look, if you didn't, then you'd be doing your job poorly, and you wouldn't be getting outcomes and results, particularly on behalf of our members. Our members in Adelaide are very different to property owners in places like Sydney and Melbourne, because the type of landlords here are private investors. They've got private skin in the game, and we've got a different market to play within. Whereas if you look in places like Sydney and Melbourne, the big property owners over there are institutional property owners. They're syndicates, they're superannuation funds. So the difference between our market and theirs is that private skin in the game. And when you've got that sort of skin in the game, it changes the way that you think and changes the way that you do business. And as a direct result, that changes the way that we advocate to government.
Yeah,
because we are representing privates.
Yes, brilliant. All right, let's talk about Daniel, the human being.
Sure.
Tell us a little about your background. How did you get to where you are today? I do know a little bit about your background, and you moved around a lot as a kid. Is that how you ended up in the property council? Always being interested in property itself.
Look, I've got quite a unique, slightly unusual background. I was born in a place called West Wyalong, which is in the middle of nowhere in New South Wales. A lot of people might have travelled through West Wyalong on the way to Sydney, but we were living in a caravan for my first 4 years. So my father and his father, carpenters. We come from a strong family lineage of carpenters and farmers. But Dad and his brother, in addition to his parents, they were just following the form construction work up and down the eastern seaboard. On the way, my brother was born in Wollongong. I was born in West Wyalong. The first of my three sisters was born in a place called Billawheeler in Queensland. So we'd shifted 12 or 13 times before I started kindergarten back in Adelaide.
Yeah, wow.
We'd lived in 5 states and territories in that time. We were carnies following the work. So property's been in my blood since I was born. I was born in a caravan on the road. I think Dad might have been building a set of apartments or units somewhere in regional New South Wales at the time. And then we moved back to South Australia it must have been about 1986-ish, because my grandfather had tended for a decommissioned school. It was the Vermont Girls High School. That school had been decommissioned, and Pop had this great idea to turn it into a retirement village. They were successful with that tender, and then we shifted back from Queensland to SA, and that's when the family business started, building, developing, owning, and managing retirement villages. So I've grown up in quite a unique part of the industry, and then I spent my professional youth working in Parliament for politicians. So it was quite a misspent youth, wandering the hallways of Parliament. I learned a lot during those times. Yeah. So I had my family upbringing on construction sites. Went to uni for a few years to study my Bachelor of Arts, did my honours, and then eventually did Masters in Communication. But I'd actually always wanted to be an architect ever since I was about 5. My brother was meant to become a carpenter, and Michael and I were meant to seamlessly transition into the family business. It didn't work out that way. I eventually realised when I was about 16 that I didn't want to become an architect anymore. Went to uni, found my way through a Bachelor of Arts, studied politics and history, and then just became immersed in the world of politics. Picked up a traineeship with a guy called Rob Lucas, who's now treasurer again. Yep. And I learned a lot from Rob in those early years. I then went on to work for Isabel Redmond in a media advisor capacity, and then for someone called Stephen Marshall, performing a similar role. And I've been the property council for the last 7 years. And the way that that's all tied together, I think, is quite simple. Family background in property and construction, early professional experience with politics, media and public relations, and now the property council. That sort of brings all of those things together. My role on any given day is about relationships with politicians, relationships with journalists, relationships with influencers and decision makers, and naturally relationships with landlords and developers here in South Australia. So that's the really short story, but it did start in a quite unusual way, living in a caravan for my first 4 years of life. We used to have a bath in the sink in the caravan that was like a pump handle tap, and pump the water in from time to time. Yeah. The old Jayco pop top caravan that's still sitting up at mum and dad's in one of the sheds. And every time I see that caravan now, I think, we've got 3 kids ourselves, and mum and dad had 3 kids in the caravan before they had 2 more back in Adelaide. Having 3 kids myself, I look at that caravan and think, how on earth did they do it?
No, it doesn't make, even just having gone through that lockdown and having the kids
that was
at
a
home.
week. That was a week.
I know.
It was hard.
It was ridiculous.
It was really hard. And when I look at that caravan, I've got no idea how they did it.
No, from a privacy point of view. But not only that, but you need your downtime, right? That's where I was going with that.
And
your
of course,
mind went in the wrong direction.
Mum and dad had 3 kids living in that caravan.
Oh, you're lucky the other 2 waited to Adelaide. Can I ask, what is it about government policies that get you out of the bed in the morning? Like, it doesn't seem to me being, and you are very strong in your communications side. So what is it? What draws you to this world?
So, as I said before, I was raised in a family that had a lot of skin in the game and still does. And when you have skin in the game, particularly at a time when interest rates are hitting 20%, even as a young kid, I've got a couple of memories of family meetings over the dinner table, at least on 2 occasions when I was probably about 10, and then again when I was about 15 or 16. Due to economic circumstances and financial circumstances, risk, on 2 occasions we almost had to move into 2 of our retirement villages. So, Dad said to the family, due to circumstances, we might have to move from Oakbank in the Adelaide Hills to, I think it was Albury Wodonga. We were building a village over there a long time ago. So I look back at experiences like that, and I've always carried this great appreciation for risk takers that have those levels of skin in the game, because that's really hard and stressful. At times it can also be incredibly rewarding. So my membership here, in terms of what I do, I'm meeting with people like that on a daily basis. They're building and owning and developing big commercial sites in Adelaide that carry incredible risk, particularly during times of pandemic and hardship and great flux and uncertainty. So I've got great lasting respect for people who take that level of risk. At the same time, they're also doing an amazing thing for the economy. They're creating jobs, they're stimulating the local market, they're literally changing the skyline on a daily basis. I find that really exciting, really interesting. And the role that we play at the Property Council is to ensure that regulatory and policy settings aren't damaging. That policies aren't getting in the way of that development, actually bringing Adelaide forward, making Adelaide incredibly exciting. I think that our city's come a really long way in the last 7 to 8 years, to be honest. I think if you haven't been to Adelaide for a long time, and you were to come here whenever borders open or whenever you're allowed to, I think if you came here and looked at this city in terms of its skyline, you'll be incredibly impressed. This CBD has been dominated by cranes and hard hats and steel caps for a long time. Adelaide's changed a lot, and they're the types of people that we represent here at the Property Council. So for me, when I get up in the morning, I know that I'm representing people like that who are taking that level of risk, who are helping change the skyline, and I take that role really seriously. Part of the job, of course, is to help execute that message, to communicate that in a proper and effective manner. And I think we do that really well here at the Property Council, and that we have done that historically, even well before my time.
Just a bit of a random question while you're talking about the skyline. There are caps to our skyline. Is that from that alone, is that when people do look into South Australia, and especially investors from all over the world who want to who do want to build high-rise buildings, is that something that is going to hold us back?
Yeah, look, the flight path is a consideration for sure. I mean, Adelaide has literally and figuratively been growing up a lot in the past 10 years, rather than necessarily growing out. We've been having that policy debate and discussion for a long time now about urban sprawl versus densification starting in the CBD and working outwards. Naturally, we'd love to see, flight path considerations relaxed a bit so that we can genuinely have some skyscrapers here in Adelaide. We have seen some really unique proposals in recent times. The Masonic Hall on North Terrace, there's a really exciting proposal there to develop what would be Adelaide's first skyscraper. Now, the further east that you head in the CBD, theoretically, the taller your building can be because the planes are at a higher point.
Okay.
The further west you go in the CBD, the lower your buildings can be because the planes are getting lower as they come down to the airport.
That'll be interesting looking from a bird's eye view in future.
But over the past 12 months, even 18 to 24 months, actually, there have been a lot of great buildings that have either been approved or that are now under construction, whether they're residential, hotels, or even commercial.
Yeah, we've seen them going up. It's amazing stuff, but it's exciting stuff. I think for me, there's and excuse the ignorance in this, there's a lot of room up there for planes to fly. Like, we can't move our city? Surely they can just find a different path. Is it not as simple as that?
Well, it's also a demand equation as well. So what we do here at the Property Council, and we have done for a long time, is there's three main policy drivers that we're always focused on. Our core business is property taxes and taxation more generally, population growth and demand, and then red tape. And typically red tape that gets in the way of development and construction. But on that second one, growth and demand, that's our great opportunity now. So it's always been a drag on us for the last 30 years. We've seen this genteel decline of our population growth rate. We've seen this mass exodus of our best and brightest kids who leave Adelaide after school or uni in search of opportunities. A lot of our friends and mates from school collectively, I'm sure you would have seen your mates leave Adelaide since you left school. I know I have. So for us, I think there's an incredible opportunity out of COVID. And I don't really like talking about the COVID thing a lot, but what I love to focus on with the post-pandemic period, whenever that might be, because I presume that we're still mid-pandemic, is Adelaide's proposition, Adelaide's value proposition now. So I think that Adelaide makes perfect sense in a post-pandemic world. I think that on the back of Adelaide, the value proposition that is Adelaide making more sense now than it ever has is centred around growth and centred around population growth. It's centred around retaining more of our young kids instead of them fleeing to cities that are far more dense than Adelaide. If there are concerns in a post-pandemic environment of super dense cities, then I think Adelaide's a direct beneficiary, and that will only lead to more people and therefore more productivity in Adelaide. Of course, what we need is, that jobs question. We need more jobs coming out of Adelaide to complement those kids staying here and coming back.
There's a few questions out of that. With the pandemic, I'm going to rattle off a couple of statistics. Has there been a silver lining from the pandemic in regards to property? When you look at, this was taken from the Property Council website. Houses in the
single source of truth.
The single. Well, that's website. It. 100%. Where else would I go, right? So house pricing in South Australia has improved by 136% in the last quarter, 550% over the past 12 months. And we talk about people coming here and using that price guide alone. I live down at Henley, good little spot there.
Yeah.
I'm not going to argue or complain
You're
at all.
You're a good beach boy, aren't you?
I am. I'm the St. Michael's boy. Grew up down at Henley and I've lived there my whole life.
And I'm an old Ross Trevor boy, so given you're a mixed boy, you and I can't really be in the same room.
No, I don't know why.
We shouldn't be.
We should cancel this conversation now. But it really, for me, there was a house on the street just sold for a record price. And a Sydney family moving over. Both work in the corporate world, and they're moving to South Australia because the they're 300 metres from the beach and it's a beautiful spot, and they can work from home and get paid Sydney wages and live here and enjoy the benefits of it all. So, there's no real need for them to walk in. So that in itself is painting a pretty good picture. Going on, you talk about staffing levels have increased by 37%, 300% since March last year. The state economic expectations have jumped by 140% in the last 12 months. So there's some good stuff coming out of this pandemic. Is it wrong to look at it as silver lining?
So I think if we look back to those really scary, uncertain times of particularly March through to May and June last year, there were forecasts and predictions of double-digit unemployment. There were forecasts and predictions of share market crashes, of a housing market that would be under incredible duress. There were all sorts of scary predictions and forecasts that shook economists and the industry to its core. If we stand here today and look back on last year, there's a lot that Adelaide has to be grateful for. We've got developments just down the road here, like 60 King William Street with Charter Hall. We've got ICD property developing the central markets. We've got Cbus down on Pirie Street there developing one of your old stomping grounds, I'm sure, the old Planet nightclub. There's incredible demand and investor interest in Adelaide. We've got a house, still to this day, we've got a median house price that starts with a 5 instead of ending in million, like you see in parts of Melbourne and Sydney. We have so many competitive advantages in a national context here in Adelaide. So I'm not surprised that you've got Sydney families or Melbourne families or even London families looking at a city like Adelaide. In recent times, the Economist Livability Index rated Adelaide not just the world's third most livable city, but Australia's most livable city. Roy Morgan in recent times, gave South Australia top marks. I think the direct quote was, South Australia's COVID management was top of the class. You've had the Victorian government in recent times release a state budget that, jacked up land tax and stamp duty taxes in Victoria. And just as one example there, if you were to purchase a $5 million commercial property in Victoria, you'll be now paying 308% more. 308% more in Victoria than you would on the same property in Adelaide. So, and the short point is this, we have an incredible argument and an incredible pitch to both investors and residents to move to South Australia. It's as simple as that. And like the Adelaide proposition has never made more sense than it does now in the middle of a global pandemic, let alone in a post-pandemic environment. And, for companies like ICD Property and Charter Hall and Cbus to be flocking to Adelaide during a pandemic, to be, literally, raising the level of our skyline, despite all the global economic uncertainty, that says incredible things about our great city.
And it does, and it's exciting. You're seeing the Googles of the world and all these new tech companies, Accenture, put out there. The problem is with some of the bigger companies. So this is a concern that the smaller businesses, and I run my own consulting, management consulting firm that was always up against the big four and the like, and and
you'll be running a big business in 5 years' time.
From our growth perspective, we are doing quite well. But getting the right people is the other thing. So when you have these companies, and I do know a lot of local, very successful IT companies who, when these big companies such as the Accentures of the world and those really well-known consulting companies come in here and say they're going to employ 1,000 people, where are they going to get those 1,000 people from? They're stealing them from the smaller businesses. So there's this two-pronged effect here in the sense of it's great. We want to get businesses, we want to get jobs, but where are we going to get these people from? Because it feels like there's a situation of robbing Peter to pay Paul at the moment in some of the industries.
I think that South Australia has historically punched above our weight. We've long done that. We've got some incredible and iconic SMEs here in Adelaide, whether you're in professional services or even in retail and food. I mean, looking at the Chapleys or the Drakes or the Romeos as an example in the supermarket world, they are genuine world-leading companies here in Adelaide that started as SMEs and that are much better than some of the bigger companies. Companies like yours, no doubt, are on this incredible growth trajectory over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think what being a South Australian and being a South Australian business owner or South Australian investor teaches you is that you've got to be better. Your value proposition's got to be greater. And as a direct result, you'll always provide greater business service to clients than many other big companies would. I guess when it comes to bigger professional services companies hiring 200, 400, 600 people, they're probably not coming from Adelaide. So the great economic opportunity for us is keeping them here instead of them, flocking back to places like Sydney and Melbourne once they've ticked a 2-year box. We don't want to see that because that's not genuine growth. That's short-term, box ticking growth. That's not sustainable. That's not long-lasting. We'd love to see those hundreds of people that do come here to get that early experience with a professional services firm, to then shift to companies like yours and others, but equally to buy a house here in Adelaide, to have kids, to send them to school, add to the economic growth, pay your taxes here. And of course, you'll be paying lower taxes here than a place like Victoria.
308%.
308%. But do it here, stay here, get to know Adelaide. Adelaide can be a cliquey place. It is relationships driven, but South Australia makes a lot of sense in a post-pandemic world, and long may that continue.
Yeah, look, I'm a SA boy through and through, and I couldn't agree more. It is a good place. It is a different place to do business, though. You feel like if you go to a Sydney, you could walk into a room and sell something on the spot, whereas you come to Adelaide and it is very much relationship-based and building those. But, we'll grow, and the bigger and bigger we get, the more and more opportunities will arise, right? So I'm interested in let's talk about the pandemic, and we've just come out of the lockdown. The 7-day lockdown.
We're day 2 now, aren't we?
We're day 2 out of the lockdown, which is, the sense of freedom is amazing at the moment. Having the kids go back to school first and
most
foremost.
importantly,
and where this sort of question came from is there's a campaign going on at the moment, and don't bring your lunch to work, and support local businesses and help them get back. And it's amazing. And that's exactly what I did yesterday, although I support local businesses for lunch every single day, much to my wife's discontent. But I went into a local little Thai shop and bought the old banh mi roll and was speaking to the locals, and they're really struggling. And they were saying that the biggest problem for them is that the land, they still need to pay rent, right? So they not only were we locked down for 7 days where they're not working, and they're kind of relying on that income. They're relying to pay their rent for their shop. They're not only their rent for their home and everything else on top of that, actually trying to put food on the table. Then on top of that, once we are back, all the big businesses aren't sending their people back. They're still working home from the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks until confidence rises and people want to send back. So the ongoing effect of the 7 days isn't just a 7-day problem. My question to you is, what conversations is the Property Council having with the landlords, and how do we look after these small businesses? Because we talk about incentives of coming into South Australia. There doesn't seem to be an incentive of starting a business within the CBD right now in this pandemic world.
Yeah, look, and COVID has had a disproportionately large impact on cities around the world because global cities are typically more dense. There's more people, there's more buses, there's more cars, and therefore there's a greater perceived or real risk in catching and transmitting COVID. The proposition with landlords and tenants has been really hard. So last year, if we go back to May last year when the Prime Minister came out and proposed a national code of conduct for commercial leases, that was a really tricky time for both landlords and tenants because it pitted a landlord against a tenant, and that happened across the country. What we saw in Adelaide in March, though, when the world started to change, was the bulk of commercial landlords here in Adelaide being well in front of governments being well in front of governments because they were already talking to the tenants about possible and proposed impacts on revenue. And the bulk of landlords, by the time the Code of Conduct came into force by probably June, the bulk of landlords had already done deals with tenants because everybody recognised and realised that it'd be much better to have a tenant at the back end of this thing as opposed to having no tenant at all.
Yep.
A lot of tenants started to innovate, which I thought was amazing. You had companies like the Stag Hotel that obviously couldn't open and operate for quite a chunk of early last year. Those guys started basically a bottle shop delivery company to deliver wine and beer to your house. So I think it's really easy to focus on some of the negatives last year, but on the flip side, there was incredible business innovation with a lot of SMEs around Adelaide because they had to. Now, the Commercial Code of Conduct was in place until, from memory, the first week of January. So let's say from June to January. And banks decided to, because of course, don't forget, banks play a really important role in this environment too. Banks were deferring some repayments and some interest. They weren't writing them off, they were deferring them. Landlords, on the other hand, were actually putting a line through a lot of their rental revenue. So landlords copped a pretty big hit last year, but they did so knowing that it was for the greater good because they wanted to retain tenants at the back end. I take your point on board about this week. It's hard. You had restaurants and cafes that had to dispose of food and all sorts of other perishable items, and that goes straight to the bottom line.
Yeah,
like that hurts them in a really big way, as does confidence and occupancy trickling back up to where it was pre-lockdown. If we just have a look at occupancy for a minute, the Property Council since July last year has been tracking occupancy of commercial office buildings across the entire country from July through to today. Adelaide dipped to a low of 55% occupancy in commercial office buildings in August last year. We're currently, pre-lockdown I should say, we're currently at about 80%.
Yeah, wow.
80% of pre-pandemic levels. Now that last 20% is probably going to be a bit sticky. It's going to be a little tricky to get that 20% back.
80-20 rule will be right.
but pre-lockdown, that was at a pretty good level.
Yeah.
Footfall had certainly strengthened. Obviously, you can walk the streets and you see for lease signs in a few buildings.
Yeah.
That has been really disheartening. So there's no doubt that it's had an incredible impact on a lot of SMEs. But landlords have copped it hard too. And then, I'm not sitting here with a violin at this point during this part of the conversation because very few people would have sympathy for landlords. I think that's a wrong perception. But the reality is they've copped it too. It's been hard for everyone. And I think that everybody, as we continue to navigate our way through the pandemic, God knows when it's going to end, everybody's just got to be conscious of everyone's financial risk and financial situations. But occupancy was lifting pre-lockdown. Vacancy rates, everybody expected commercial office vacancy rates to go through the roof because there was that early, gut feel by a lot of forecasters, probably the same forecasters who said that unemployment would go to double digits.
Yeah.
They said that commercial offices would reduce in size because everyone's going to work from home forever. Well, we don't accept that at all. Flexibility in the workplace was here before the pandemic, and it will certainly still be here post-pandemic. But vacancy rates in the Adelaide CBD have decreased. They've decreased over the past 12 months, which I think is an incredible result. It's a sign of the resilience of the Adelaide office market. Now, it's still at about 15%.
Yeah.
There's still about 200,000 square metres of empty space in the Adelaide CBD, but it's not going up. It's come down. So it's on the mend.
Are we going to see trends? Because there would be already contracts in place 5 years, 10 years, Are we going to see that come down in 3, 4, 5 years' time? Is that when we're going to see?
Fair question. Yeah, and my lease, for example, is 5 years.
Yeah.
Most companies would have a 5-year lease. So there's no doubt that we're only 15 to 18 months into a 5-year cycle, let's call it. So we're probably not going to see the full impact for another 3 years in that commercial office space. There's no doubt about it. But what we hear in the market already, and we heard it from mid last year, was that architects are now redesigning workspaces that are bigger, not necessarily small. They're bigger so that companies can actually insulate themselves against future proximity and health-based pandemics. So, we've got companies that are now putting 2 meters in between every workstation. Based on Nicholas Spurrier and SA Health guidelines about 1.5 meters physical distancing. So we think there'll be more of that. So I don't think it's as easy as saying that every workspace is going to reduce in size and every commercial landlord is going to suffer and the commercial property investment market won't be a good investment in 5 years' time. I don't think that's the case because the work from home trend was here before COVID. It'll be here after COVID. The question is how great an influence will it actually have on big companies and some of those big global companies that have made global decisions out of places like New York and Beijing and London. The question is, when do those companies change their decision making and allow some of their regional offices in places like Adelaide? When do they allow their people to come back to the office? Because we think that South Australia's handling of COVID's been textbook. We think that our comparative advantages around resilience and health and safety are second to none. Now, the recent lockdown was a bit of a blip.
No doubt.
We'll bounce back.
The question of the lockdown is a different political issue. It's about what's more important is, safety or economics and all this sort of stuff. So that's a whole world that we could dive into and talk for hours. That's not really what we're trying to gain out of this conversation, though. The interesting thing really is about the effect that the ongoing effect of the city. What are we doing to promote growth back into the city, to promote businesses? I know back in the I'm not 100% sure if it's still running the Renew SA stuff, where it was getting
Renew Adelaide,
where we were getting. We're offering potential office spaces for free for
30-day leases.
Months, and is that sort of some of the promotions that the Property Council are looking at? How do we get people back into the city, really supporting it, making it vibrant in a world that is unknown right now? Or are we just going to wait and sit it out?
Well, we can't afford to just wait and sit it out, can we? Yeah. I was on the board of Renew Adelaide for 5 years. That's a great organisation here in Adelaide. It's
Steve Morris?
Steve was chair of Renew Adelaide for a long time. Nick Bagakis has been chair for the past 5.5 years. The beauty about that company is that it brings together entrepreneurs and landlords. Now, they are two constituencies that would rarely cross paths, but we've got a lot of progressive landlords in Adelaide that are willing to put their spaces on the line at no cost to help these entrepreneurs get out of the ground.
Is that mainly for retail or is it anyone?
No, it's hospitality, retail, the arts. Oliver Brown, who runs the Stag and Nola and Anchovy Bandit on Prospect Road, he was a really early Renew Adelaide tenant. And at the time that a lot of these creatives commercialise their business, that's when they start paying rent. So it gets them out of the ground in a lot of these empty spaces in unique parts of the city, breathes life back into arcades and malls. The Renew Adelaide model works really well when you can cluster a lot of tenants together. A lot of those landlords are foregoing rent, of course, but they're also taking a punt that a lot of these creatives will become successful commercial operations in a relatively short period of time. When it comes to initiatives and incentives to get people back into the CBD, the Property Council came up with this proposition probably back in April or May. And we put a proposition to Stephen Marshall and Rob Lucas and said, look, when we have a look at footfall across the Adelaide CBD, Mondays and Fridays were being disproportionately hit. A lot of workers were taking long weekends might be an unfair way to characterise it, but they were typically working from home on Mondays and Fridays.
Correct.
And they were coming to the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. A lot of hospitality providers, a lot of restaurateurs derive the bulk of their revenue on Fridays, the Friday lunch trade. So we said to the government, why don't we come up with this idea? Let's call it Fomo Fridays, fear of missing out on Fridays. Let's come up with a fun, cool, exciting initiative that's a bit of a three-way partnership between City Council, state government, and the private sector. So everybody plays their part. So landlords might chuck $200 across the counter in the cafe in the foyer of the building every Friday for 4 weeks. The local restaurant might have lunch specials. City council might decide to put on a concert in the park.
Yep.
We might do some yoga sessions.
Yep.
First thing in the morning. The state government, Stephen Marshall turned around and said, "I love that idea. It's great because at least we're having a crack."
Yep.
And the state government put $800,000 forward for Fomo Fridays. That would basically take over September. So hopefully the world is looking a bit better.
Yeah, I saw you guys launch that. It was good. Yeah, great.
Great initiative, great partnership with the state government. We can't just sit back. We can't roll over and accept that things have to be this way, because there's a lot of business owners in the CBD that are struggling.
Yeah, they are.
We've got to do everything that we can to make sure that they are staying in business. And if that means you and I are having a beer after work at 4 o'clock on a Friday because your boss lets you leave the office an hour early, happy days.
Yeah.
Come to work, do your work. There's a lot more productivity that can be gained from the workplace, than you'll ever get from home. Knock off an hour early, go to the pub, have a beer. You know what? Have a beer for you, have a beer for your boss, and have one for the economy too. Don't drive home.
Yeah, that's right.
Catch a bus or an Uber. And make sure you wear your face mask.
Yeah.
But come back to the office.
Yeah. Is there an opportunity to talk to the businesses about people taking time off on Fridays and especially Fridays? Mondays, everyone wants to take the Mondays off and work from home to get that extra day in. But the Fridays, if right now we've got we had a team catch up booked in on this Friday. Pre-lockdown, it was booked in weeks and weeks ago, and come in and support the locals, and that's really what we're after. Right now, we're considering moving it virtual purely for the simple fact that we can't, in this environment, we can't have all of our staff in one place at the one time, let alone would we be able to fit into one place at the one time. Yeah. So these are the concerns, but we're really sort of pushing from our team, our staff, that come in and support locals and let's go out and have a drink on a Friday afternoon and support the local restaurants and pubs and stuff like that. Is it something that we can promote to businesses and business owners and all that sort of stuff as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It is really hard at the moment because you do have to follow health guidelines. SA Health is right. We are taking a really cautious approach to this virus, and so we should. But obviously that does have a disproportionate impact on the economy. So naturally, businesses should be operating the way that you are at the moment until those recommendations change and the restrictions lift. But when those restrictions do lift, like they will over coming weeks, come back to the office, come back to the CBD. It's not unsafe. The CBD is not an unsafe place. And if you stay working from home in the suburbs forever, by the time you come back to the city, it's going to look pretty disastrous. And given CBDs around the world are the engine rooms of economies everywhere, we just have to be really conscious of that. If there's no CBD, there's no GSP. It's as simple as that.
Why is that?
Well, because you've got employers. You've got construction and development happening in CBD. As I said before, I can point to half a dozen incredible major developments happening right now in the CBD, commercial developments, office towers. If these office towers are built and that $470 million that Charter Hall's investing at 60 King William Street is all for nothing, then economies start to collapse. You look at a place like the Central Markets development, you've got an interstate developer, ICD property, looking to breathe life back into that precinct. We can't have people in the suburbs and not shopping at places like the Central Markets. There's an incredible level of investment that goes into the CBD. Adelaide Oval, for example. That's a 55,000 seat stadium. We can't have nobody watching footy games forever. It is interesting, though. I mean, even over the past 12 months, whilst occupancy has been low, football crowds have still been high when they've been allowed to be high. So people are coming back to the CBD. They're picking and choosing the reasons to come back to the city. But I got to say, I mean, my team here at the Property Council, we can work effectively remotely, but we work a lot better sitting in this boardroom with these whiteboards behind you at the moment, chucking ideas up there.
No doubt. The big part of our business is we work with companies through their culture transformation, that whole space. Culture and leadership being two of the biggest issues at the moment in working from home is leaders aren't really quite uncertain how to lead a team who are not in front of them. It's a big problem. But then also it's the human connection piece, right? Being in a room, having conversation. It's those conversations at the water cooler where you might pick something up. It's hey, when you scream over the other side of the room, hey, did you hear about this? And then someone on the other side of the room's going, no, you should do this, this, and this. I've tried that before. Those ideas all of a sudden are no longer existent. So we do believe the hybrid model is here to stay. Most businesses are, and I think the staff are very willing to have 1 or 2 days where they can stay at home on a Friday or and do the washing and prepare for the weekend. I think that's really what it's all about. But we're seeing the trends that, from a mental health perspective, that not being in the room with your peers, not being around and discussing, having those robust discussions and just getting that human interaction constantly is having an effect on people.
I remember Stephen Marshall early last year changing his rhetoric pretty early on from a 2-pillar focused response to COVID to a 3-pillar focus. So of course the first 2 were SA health generally and the economy. 2 pillars. The 3rd pillar became mental health. And that is a really important consideration because you don't know what your colleagues or your staff are going through if you're not there with them. So this has been tricky. It's been hard. Things will bounce back. The economy will repair, but it won't happen unless people start to change their behaviours. Just to give you one example, last year, well, in fact, every year the Property Council holds a big Christmas party, a big Christmas lunch with the industry.
I don't remember the invite, but that's fine. I'm joking.
We would typically have about 1,000 people coming to our lunch, Daniel, and you've not been one of them. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. That'll change.
Yeah, thanks, mate. I'm on the email list.
So last year was really hard. The convention centre last year, the Adelaide Oval, they were seeing cancellations coming at them left, right, and centre. The density restrictions were really tricky. The outdoor versus indoor thing was really tricky. But given that my team at the Property Council, we were in the office last year, we were throwing ideas on the whiteboard every day, we decided to come up with something really bizarre, really different to try to work with the changing nature of restrictions last year. And it wouldn't have happened unless we were together in the office. But we decided to hold our Christmas lunch in a disused hangar at the Adelaide airport. Now, it was disused because Qantas decided to remove a plane because, of course, they were flying fuel planes last year. That hangar originally came from Alice Springs in, I think it was the mid-1950s, and Qantas had been a continuous tenant in that disused military hangar ever since. It became vacant. We were throwing all sorts of ideas on the table about where we could go outdoors to hold our Christmas lunch. We spoke to the airport and they jumped on board straight away. Now, that sort of collaboration, productivity, creativity couldn't have happened unless we were together, unless we were deliberately thinking about how to do things differently. We had an incredible day in a disused hangar with the door up, perfect conditions, with a Qantas jet sitting in the background there. We had an amazing day. There were so many moving parts that day. Probably 100 of them. If one of them had gone wrong, it would have been a complete disaster. But I think there's a really good story in that for businesses generally. That's my business's story about being forced to think differently and to innovate and to collaborate. But you can't do that at home. You can't do that unless everybody's sitting around that boardroom table being forced to think outside the square, to do things differently, to pick up the phone and call someone to ask if you can collaborate with them. We think you get a lot more productivity and better outcomes sitting in the office as opposed to sitting at home.
Yeah, you're right. Oh, yes. You can be productive on Zoom and on the Teams calls, but it becomes very transactional. You're right. The level of innovation is reduced considerably. I don't have any statistics around that, but it is reduced considerably from what we're seeing in the market. Let's go back to Daniel Gannon's rise to fame and the land tax. You're talking about the 308. You came up against couple of your old mentors in Rob Lucas and Stephen Marshall.
Mm.
That would have been a pretty difficult time.
That was fun, wasn't
it?
Yeah. Land tax actually feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah.
Now.
2019.
Yeah, so it was the FY20 state budget, so it was June 2019. Yeah, look, that one caught us a little bit by surprise. That particular campaign and battle's been well documented, but that one was hard. That one was hard because I did spend 5 or 6 years working with Rob Lucas a long time ago now, and also a couple of years with Stephen Marshall. But that said, I mean, in the end, despite having very early and public differences of opinion, we did finish on the same page. So we did come, like there was a deal that was done. There was a great outcome that was achieved.
Can you give us a little bit of a rundown on what?
Yeah, sure.
What the feud was?
Yeah. So basically, in the 2019 state budget, the state government put forward retrospective changes to land tax aggregation. So that is the way that land tax is billed, the way that properties are aggregated to then produce a landlord's land tax bill. And the worst part about the proposition, Daniel, was that it was retrospective. And the problem with retrospectivity with legislation is it means that you are shifting the goalposts on investors after they've already made their investment. And fundamentally, we just don't think that that's a fair or good thing to do. It's actually a really risky thing to do.
Yeah.
So we did have a big difference of opinion. From memory, the state government, I think, budgeted for an additional $40 million in land tax revenue, and we called that out really early and said, you know what, it's going to be 3 times that amount at least. We think it's going to be about $120 million. We think that there are some incredible risks here, not just for institutional, bigger landlords, but also for mum and dad investors.
Yep.
So we got in contact with a lot of property owners across the state through the course of our campaign. What we were asking for was really simple. We were asking for a fair go for land tax. We were asking for better consultation. We were asking for a better deal. I think that campaign went on for about 5 months. We were going head to head almost on a daily basis for that 5-month period. That's not true, for about 4 months, because of course we did eventually come together and produce a really good, effective outcome for the majority of property owners in South Australia. But that was taxing at a personal level, given the nature of the relationships that I have with Rob and Stephen. And of course, that's also been well documented. So that was hard. That was a really tricky year. But at the end of the day, we were able to sit down with Rob Lucas, hatch a far better set of arrangements. And in the end, the top rate of land tax has reduced from 3.7%, which has long been historically anti-competitive, not just uncompetitive. 3.7% top land tax rate above about $1 million has long been anti-competitive. That's dropped by almost 40% now to 2.4%. So we are now nationally competitive, and we've doubled the top thresholds. The top threshold's now in excess of $2 million. So what we've ended up with is a far better outcome for investors, a far better outcome for a lot of mum and dad investors and a lot of big institutional investors here in South Australia. So we think, in addition to the fact that we don't have stamp duty on commercial property transactions anymore, which we achieved back in 2015, 2016, as a package, no commercial stamp duty and a far more competitive land tax environment, that's a great pitch to investors. So the land tax battle of 2019, it does feel like that was a long time ago now, but we managed to get back on the same, get around the table, get a far better deal put on the table, and then convince people like John Darley in the Legislative Council that the latest deal was actually a good deal for the state. And I can still say to you now that was a good deal, and that these are great arrangements now from an investment perspective, and they'll be long lasting.
Brilliant. Is that the time in your career that you feel propelled you to a different level? Because you're fighting for a cause.
Well, it was a great risk and a great opportunity at the same time. I've been in the Property Council for 7 years now, And I think one thing that's really important is whenever I do leave this job and go to the next one, that I'll be able to look back knowing that we've, as an industry, worked really well together, and that we've produced some outcomes like no commercial stamp duty, like significant reductions to land tax. We've defeated things like taxes on CBD car parks, the state bank tax, of course, from a few years ago. I'd like to think that as an industry, we'll be able to look back knowing that we've left an incredible legacy that should now be long-lasting. Land tax was a risk. It was also an opportunity. But to be honest, I think for anyone's career, what you need are relationships in different places at different times to ensure that you can do a good deal, that you can get a deal done, that you can collaborate with different people from different sides of the political spectrum to ensure that your industry, and of course mine is property, is better off. Now, it doesn't happen all the time. We've worked really hard to make sure that property is always at the forefront of political decision-making. That's why we're quite public about the things that we do, whether they're positive or negative or neutral. We think that part of our role is to provide a voice of economic commentary from time to time to ensure that both punters and politicians know exactly what the plight of property is. And we think that we've done some pretty incredible things over the past 10 to 20 years as an organisation, but particularly the last 5 to 8.
I'll touch on your ability to create and maintain relationships. It's a skill set that is much needed in business in all walks of life. What is your approach to creating new relationships, or are you at a point where status helps provide you any in, or and talk to us about how you grew to that point where getting your name out there was required for you to actually start having an influence on the market?
When I started the Property Council back in 2014, I didn't know how to run a business.
Yeah.
That was really new to me. I'd always led teams of people, but I'd never actually been running a balance sheet.
Yeah. So what role did you start in when you came?
Executive director.
Yeah. So you came straight into. So you started this whole.
No, I didn't start the company.
But
I came in as executive director back in 2014. Yeah. From a commercial perspective, we run about 20 to 30 events in an ordinary year.
Yeah.
Lunches, breakfast seminars, study tours. So there's a big commercial part of what we do. But we do that to build a platform to talk about our advocacy, to talk about our policy ambitions, to give politicians and business owners a stage to put forward and defend things. We use that stage from time to time to put a flag in the ground from a defensive perspective, but we also do it to help celebrate great successes. But I think at the end of the day, you've got to have a value proposition. I know that when I knock on the doors of politicians, Labor, Liberal alike, what I want them to see isn't me, because the reality is it's not about me. And like the Property Council will be here after I go, and it was certainly here before I came. But my challenge has always been that when they see me, they don't just see me. They look over my shoulder and they see an army of investors that this state has, an army of proud investors and proud business owners that do incredible things for this state, that take incredible amounts of risk. And that's what the Property Council, I think, is really good at, mobilising bodies of people, mobilising investors and landlords like we did with land tax. The land tax campaign was a really great example because we all came together knowing that we were wanting to achieve the same thing, and that was to get rid of this really bad idea that was put forward. That could have been helped if there was consultation. I think we could have come to the same outcome.
Yeah.
If we'd spoken about it 2 months before.
So poor stakeholder management.
Well, it's just not the way that I would have done it. I've spent the last 5 to 7 years, but even before that, to be honest, building relationships, maintaining relationships, curating those relationships, and trying to ensure that I've never burnt them. Because the Adelaide market, as you know, isn't a market where you can afford to burn them. And if you've burnt them, then at some point you've got to work on rebuilding them. So Adelaide is a relationship-based business community, And what I spend most of my time doing on a daily basis is sitting down with people, having coffees, meeting new people, or sitting down with coffees and curating existing relationships that I've got, spending time with people. I mean, I love the fact that my members take me along on their journey when they're developing a project or building an incredible building, or even, one of my members builds shallow sea ports up on the New York Peninsula. I mean, like, that's incredible stuff. Like, productive infrastructure like that is really exciting and different. So I love the fact that they take me with them on their journey and they expose me to really different things. So when I do walk into someone's office to ask for things or to suggest to people to not do certain things, that they're not seeing me, because I'll be replaced when I leave. There'll be another executive director of the property council, but they see that army of people over my shoulder who will always be here. They'll always be invested in this state, because the beauty about property is it's rooted here. These guys are long-term, patient investors wanting to do the right thing by their state, wanting to do the right thing by their portfolio.
What is the benefit of these investors to join property council? Like, why not just buy something and just be on your own? Like, why would they become a member?
I think that'd be a really short-sighted view for people to take. So we know what our value proposition is. We've got a great track record of really positive advocacy outcomes that benefits the property industry, that benefits the investment environment here in this state. If this organisation didn't exist, we'd still be stuck with a land tax rate that's almost 4% rather than one that's closer to 2%. If it wasn't for this organisation, we'd probably still have commercial stamp duty in place. You've now got investors flocking to this city, buying up property because they can save 5.5% right up front. That's a huge amount of money when you're buying a $200 million building. If it wasn't for the Property Council and other allied industry associations like Business SA or the master builders, our constituents will be worse off. So I think it'd be a really short-sighted view to have, because we know what our value proposition is. We know that we're the best in the market at doing it. And when we do sit down with prospective new members, we say to them, you've got to be part of the community, because it's going to benefit you. It's going to benefit your business. The events that we hold, you might develop a new relationship over lunch with someone that you wouldn't have had you not come. So not only can we connect people to people, we connect business to business, but we provide stages and platforms for people to talk about what they do as a business. We've got a big community here in Adelaide. We've got about 2,500 members across the country. They are memberships that are business-wide rather than individual memberships. In Adelaide, we've got about 300 members, but a community of about 15,000 people. Now, that's a pretty powerful community if and when it does come time to mobilise and campaign against something again, because I'm sure it'll happen. Governments of every persuasion always put forward ideas that we think are short-sighted or poor, and we'll always call them out for it.
Are you, in regards to the land tax of 2019, it was a reactive campaign. You saw this policy come through, and you went up against it, and ultimately came to a really great conclusion for the investors and the property holders of South Australia. Moving forward, does the Property Council look at ways to be innovative? You got the Fomo Fridays, which is a unique in its own right. Then you've got this land tax campaign.
It's quite a serious one.
Well, which is completely, you can think about it worlds apart.
Light
right?
and shade.
So if we're looking at campaigns, are you forward thinking? Are you working proactively with the government, or is it very much a reactionary space? How does it all come into play?
Well, a lot of the things that we do never actually see the light of day.
Okay.
So we're having conversations with politicians, and we've long done this, but we're having conversations from a defensive place to ensure that bad decisions aren't made. We're trying to cut them off at the pass. And occasionally what happens with policy making is someone will put up an idea in a different jurisdiction. Let's take the foreign investor tax, for example. That was put up in one of the Eastern Seaboard jurisdictions a couple of years ago. And then it caught on. It was it spread like wildfire around the country. And then eventually every jurisdiction decided to put forward foreign investor taxes, which we said at the time was a race to the populist bottom. It was quite a xenophobic tax that was put forward. And in South Australia, that came in after the state bank tax was defeated, because the state government wanted to try to generate some more revenue. Now, we think if the answer is higher taxes, new taxes, augmented taxes, then we're asking the wrong question, because the answer should never be let's just jack taxes up. The answer should be let's talk about growth and productivity first. And that's why our three core pillars of tax, growth and red tape will always be there, particularly for a market of landlords that are private investors. But, for example, we worked really hard last year on the Commercial Code of Conduct. And we've worked really hard in recent times to ensure that doesn't come back, because landlords are still working with their tenants to make sure that they are still sustainable and that they'll still be standing on their feet post-pandemic. We just don't think that mandated regulation is ever the right way forward. We think that less red tape is the answer, not more red tape, because it can get in the way of investment and productivity and growth in South Australia.
Brilliant. In regards to those three pillars, growth being one that I'm in love with, and I really want to see South Australia move forward as a state and not become the old backwater state that we've been often referred to.
Unfairly.
Absolutely unfairly, and that was a few years ago now. What are we doing from a growth perspective that is going to attract the people to continually flock here? And if is it the case of build it and they will come, or is it do we get people and then build it? Well, how chicken and egg sort of stuff?
Well, look, I mean, outside a general population mantra of one for mum, one for dad, and one for the property council, it's probably a little trickier than that. That said, I mean, there's every chance that we'll see a bit of a baby boom post-pandemic. I think we are probably seeing a little bit of that. Population growth for most people is probably one of those things that just turns you off. There's probably people who might have even turned the volume down on this conversation right now because we're talking about something pretty dry. But in reality, population growth is one of the most important indicators for this state.
Agreed.
Pre-pandemic, Victoria, as a state, was growing by more people every 27 days than South Australia would grow across an entire year.
Yeah, wow.
Just think about that.
That's huge.
Every 27 days, they were getting the same growth that we see in 12 months.
That's why that bloody Westgate Bridge is always getting upgraded every.
But that is an extraordinary.
That is a
two-speed population
big difference.
growth, and that's not sustainable. Naturally, the economies in Sydney and Melbourne are far greater and stronger than ours. So population growth is a really important place for us to start. Now, the state government over the past few months has rightly been trumpeting the fact that the net interstate migration statistic is now in positive terms. We are now retaining more people as a state than we're losing, which hasn't happened probably for 30 years in South Australia. Now, naturally, borders are part of that. Like there has been a global tendency for people to come home. But I do think that South Australia can be an incredible beneficiary of COVID, of this pandemic, as long as we can get that value proposition right. We are Australia's most livable city. We have been touted as having the best COVID management, top of the class, by Roy Morgan. We are a far more competitive place to invest. Victoria's making us look better at the moment, I think. But population growth is so super important. Now, I've got 3 kids. I've done my bit. I've given one to mum, dad, and the property council. We would encourage more people to do that. But on a serious note, and the state government does agree with this as well. They share this opinion. We do have to trumpet ourselves far greater than we ever have. We do have to make the most of this pandemic. We can't waste the opportunity that we've got now in a world that where health proximity and the densification of CBDs are, I think, wrongly seen by some people as a risk. And as a direct result, we've got to start thinking about those job opportunities on the other side. Lot 14, that is a great bow. That's a great tool to have in the toolkit, I think.
Without doubt.
It's a really good tool.
It's a good launching pad.
But it can't be the only tool.
No.
We need to have more tools in that toolkit to ensure that we are offering more opportunities to more kids and more of those clever entrepreneurs and startups.
It's getting people over here. I think and this pandemic has been a problem, and I'm going to rattle off some statistics that were provided to me. They might be around the mark. I'm not going to say they're 100% accurate, but from my understanding that there was 230 odd thousand in 2019, 230 odd thousand that came into Australia from overseas looking for work. In 2020 it was 30,000, and in 2021 we're net negative. So we're not getting the quality of people,
the migrants
that we would otherwise get. And again, I don't know how true those statistics are. They were provided to me. It sounds roughly close to where it might be though. Is that something that the Property Council and yourself are concerned about, and having close ties to the government? Is there something that we need to really ramp up quickly?
Well, I mean, I think the reality there is that we can't do anything about borders at the moment. Migrants are really important.
Well, we can.
Well, at some point in time,
if we choose economics before health, right? And at what point does that call get made?
Well, I don't think that call's going to be made at the moment because decisions are being made based on health advice. But borders will reopen. The vaccination rate will pick up around the country. I read in the paper earlier this week, that we should be looking at a vaccination rate of 80%. Under 40s can't get Pfizer yet. There's been some concerns around AstraZeneca. The vaccination rate will pick up. And when that rate does pick up, borders will reopen. And I think once that does happen, and once we can re-welcome migrants to South Australia, that they will flock here. Because we haven't achieved some of those incredible accolades that I've mentioned earlier over the past 12 months. And that will attract more people to this state. Our challenge ahead of us is to make them sticky, to keep them here, to make sure that they do have meaningful job opportunities, to make sure that they do have great cost of living and an incredibly envious lifestyle here, like you and I do enjoy living in the suburbs of Adelaide. But the challenge for us is simple. I mean, I think that it does start with population growth. At some point when borders reopen, more people will come here. Migrants are important in terms of that population equation, but so is the brain drain. So is the brain drain, and they are incredibly productive, those young ones, because what I hate seeing is, seeing a young Adelaide person leave Adelaide, they go to a place like Melbourne or Sydney, and they get married to a Victorian or someone from New South Wales. They have kids over there, and you either don't see them come back or they don't come back for 20 years. So they're paying taxes in a different jurisdiction. They're purchasing property and perishables in a different jurisdiction. We're not seeing any economic benefit from that. So that is a huge drain. So if we can make them sticky now because of COVID, that's the opportunity that I think we should all embrace. I don't think that people should be afraid of growth. There's often been that binary conversation about growth and congestion on our roads. We don't have congested roads. We don't have a huge CBD. I'd like to see our CBD more dense and taller and more productive. I'd love to see, in a post-pandemic environment, more people trading in their backyards for balconies. I'd love to see the CBD bustling with life and activity and economic output. That will return. That'll come. But in the interim, while borders are closed, let's make the most of it. Let's remind people all over the world how great a place Adelaide is, South Australia is, because of course we've got some great regions. Let's make the most of that opportunity now. Let's tell that story now. Let's pick up your pom-poms and start cheerleading for Team South Australia. Because there's a lot going on here.
I don't think you're ever going to stop the people moving away, right? I think it's just about how do we keep more here, but also how do we attract the Melbourneites and the Sydney-siders to come to Adelaide, right, as opposed to staying there. I think that's going to be more of our question. How do we, almost fair trade against each other, and we swap over, and because the idea of staying in one place for your whole life can cause anxiety in some people, right? I mean, you've moved away, you've moved around the place and lived. Most people, well, not most people, some people may not want that from themselves. Therefore, that's why they move. I think it's just about how do we make Adelaide a much more attractive place.
So I think this is a really important conversation. This is a really important question. economically particularly, but at a time, and it's important to situate this this conversation in the context of the work from home thing.
Yeah.
So I think the opportunity is a really unique one because we're at this crossroad historically where employers are allowing their staff around the world to work from wherever they like.
Yeah.
You don't have to work from the office, okay? Work from home. So if you're sitting in London, New York, if you're sitting in Singapore or even places like Sydney at the moment, and they're going through some incredible duress over there, if you're sitting there working from home in a place like Sydney or a really expensive capital city in terms of housing affordability, and your boss is allowing you to work from wherever you like, I think that means that you can choose to live wherever you like. So if you can work from wherever you want, that means you can choose to live wherever you want. So if you can choose to live wherever you like, I think Adelaide makes complete sense because we do have a median house price that starts with a 5. You know, we are effectively a 20 to 30 minute city. So I think that the proposition is a really clear one. And then by the time you are working remotely and living in Adelaide, I think you'll find pretty quickly that you just want to go back to the office in the CBD.
Yeah.
Because we are comparatively safe, we're comparatively healthy and resilient. So I think that the proposition and pitch is a really simple one. But we should be shouting that from the rooftops. We should be, as a state, advertising in every major newspaper across the world right now, talking up the virtues of this great CBD.
Third most livable
in the world.
In the world.
Most livable in this country.
That's right.
Far more livable than Melbourne.
Yes. Yes. Mate, I'm an SA boy through and through. You got no arguments from me. Righto, we're coming to the end of the podcast. What is the future for Daniel Gannon? You've been touted. There's a few articles floating around, trade minister and all this sort of stuff. And what is your future look like? Where do you place yourself, and what does your life look like in the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, look, I'm still in my 30s. I'm 40 next year, but I'm hanging on to my 30s for as long as I can. Look, I've had a really good time at the Property Council. It's exposed me to some incredible people and businesses doing great things, some crystal ball gazers to risk takers to job creators. There's this incredible community out there in the property sector in this state. I've really enjoyed advocacy. I've really enjoyed standing up for people and achieving outcomes that benefit their business and this city. Look, the short answer is, to cut to the chase, I don't know.
It's a very diplomatic answer.
I've spent 7 years at the Property Council, and by the way, I'm in no rush to leave this great organisation.
No doubt. I think though, all people would be silly to think that they could hold you in one. Like, you're a pretty ambitious person, right? And you want to do great things. You're an advocate for South Australia. If there's an opportunity for you to do more, you'd be silly not to look at it.
Look, that's exactly right. So, I'm an advocate for property owners. I'm an advocate for business owners and developers and investors, and I'll keep doing that for the time being.
Well done. You played that very well straight, Matt. You did play a bit of cricket in your day.
I'm a tennis player.
Oh, you're a tennis player.
I make a really bad cricketer. Unlike you were a very good cricketer.
Yeah, we won't dive into that. To finish off the podcast, we always ask a few quick fire questions. I like to throw in a few curlies here and there.
A couple of bounces.
Yeah, a couple aimed at the teeth. We're a very big on reading and self-development at SynergyIQ, which is my business, Creating Synergy podcast. Our listeners are big learners. As you can imagine, the topics that we talk about are always about how do we improve and get better. And we're big readers. So what's one book that you are reading right now? I'm reading The Happiest Man on Earth by Eddie Jaku.
Oh yes, I've heard that.
I've heard that's a great read.
An amazing story. It's a story of a Holocaust survivor. It's a story of resilience and adaptability. My honours at uni was in politics and history, and I took a really strong focus on World Wars I and II. And actually wrote my thesis on how to perpetuate the memory of the Holocaust in a post-Holocaust world. I think from memory the title was something like Shadows of Holocaust Past: The Dilemma of the Fictional Filmmaker. So how can we situate and horrific historical circumstance, how we situate something that was so horrific, perpetrated by Adolf Hitler and Germany, in a way that perpetuates the memory, because the memory is a really important one. It's really important that we don't forget about those atrocities. So most of my books are history focused, but Eddie Jaku's written this amazing story.
Yeah.
I'm only halfway through.
That's fine.
But I would recommend you to pick that one up.
I'm going to get onto it. Have you heard the Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning? You would have read that as part of your...
Yeah, incredible.
It's one of the all-time greats. And I think if you couple those two up, the psychology of the mind and how we can get through anything is quite prevalent in today's society.
Well, it is. And like, it's just unthinkable when you look back at some of those atrocities that took place. It's horrible.
Is there any book other than those historical books, any book that you could recommend to those who are looking to improve in their career and grow? But any personal development books that you might have read, or anything that really had an effect on you early on in your career?
I spend a disproportionately large amount of my time reading two types of literature. One, newspapers. And two, historic books about World Wars I and II. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, an amazing book. But look, and that's probably to my own professional failing, to be honest.
No, but I think if you read those books with the idea of the mentality of the people that are in them, right, that's where the learning comes from. It doesn't necessarily need to be non-fiction. Those fictional books are great.
So they are stories of resilience.
Yeah, that's right.
They are stories of surviving and adapting to changing circumstances. So I guess the bridge between those types of books and those types of learnings to what I do is about adapting and about changing and about being resilient in the face of, in my context at the Property Council, bad policy ideas that are put forward. How do you get through that? And of course, that's in no way diminishing the import of those books. But look, on a daily basis, I read The Australian, the Financial Review, The Advertiser, and in Daily. That's a lot of news every day. And one thing that I've not been able to shake from working in politics is reading tomorrow's news at about 11 o'clock every night. At some point, I've got to shake that. So I am a little news obsessed, in addition to reading stories about World Wars I and II.
There's a argument in the world, this is not a question, there's an argument in the world that reading and watching too much news will have a serious negative impact on your life, just purely because of the negativity that comes out of those newspapers. Have you found that to be an issue by consuming so much news?
Well, I think at the front of newspapers there's a fair bit of bad news, but there's also a lot of colourful news, a lot of human interest stories. But the deeper you go, particularly into the business pages, there are a lot of positive stories about business. Yeah, there are. I mean, the Advertiser's business journal, almost on a weekly basis, has incredible stories of innovation and growth. In Daily has a really unique range of stories from hard politics to, sport and arts and culture. There's a lot of newspapers if you're willing to spend the time to look for them. I think it would be easy to say that newspapers only carry negative stories. A lot of the bigger stories are negative stories because they're about...
That's what sells, isn't it?
Yes, sometimes it does. The Adelaide Crows, I think, sell most newspapers in this town. And that,
unfortunately.
Well, that pleases me when they're playing well. We are going through a bit of a tricky time at the moment as a club, but we'll bounce back.
I hope not. Actually, it's funny. I'm a good South Australian boy and don't support a South Australian team.
Now that's very diplomatic.
That is very strange. I just grew up following Geelong. The great man Gary Ablett had the number 5 on my back, and when the Port and Crows came into the competition,
you stuck with Geelong.
I stuck with Geelong. So.
Tony Modra didn't bring you across. No, he played in a very similar way to Gary.
I must admit, I went out in the backyard and screamed out the odd Modra when I took a good mark. Yeah. But Ablett was probably thrown around a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. But I won't hold that against you.
No. We've had a good run, so I can't complain too much.
Right. Yeah. I hope that comes to a crashing halt.
That's what everyone hopes, but it won't. So Too good a club, mate. Any other podcasts that you listen to?
I listen to the Corona Cast every morning.
Oh, yes.
Just to get a quick fire daily update.
Yeah, nice. Beautiful.
A bit of a national context there.
Yeah, great. If you could have 3 people for dinner, who would they be?
That is hard.
Anyone in the world.
Anyone in the world for dinner.
And let's open that up to dead or alive.
Dead or alive. Okay. Dead or alive, 3 people for dinner. Well, my wife has to take one of those seats, so that leaves 2 more.
Oh, you've just won a lot of points there.
That leaves 2 more. Look, I'm going to say, I'll give you my political dinner party list. I would love to sit down and have dinner with John Howard and Bob Hawke.
Okay. Great.
And if I was able to bring one more in addition to Monique, my wife, it's probably Paul Keating. I mean, these are ghosts of politics past now in terms of the way that politics and Parliament as an institution used to be played. There were some incredible characters in Parliament and politics historically, and that's changed a lot now. Politicians, a lot of them have less conviction than people like John Howard, Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. Back in their time politically, they were able to carry off great and lasting economic reforms, whether it's superannuation or negative gearing or a lot of the reforms that John Howard put through in his 10 years. Politics has changed a lot. Policy making's changed a lot. I guess that dinner would be a bit of a politically tragic dinner, though, wouldn't it? With that guest list,
an interesting conversation.
It would be. But outside of that, I think it's hard for me on the spot.
That's right. We can stick with those. We don't have to do.
I'll take.
They're supposed to be quick fire questions.
Yeah, I'll take. Yeah, very good point. Well made.
What's some of the best advice that you've ever received?
Yeah, I mean, when I worked for Stephen Marshall, he would almost on a daily basis tell his team to not major in the minors.
Yeah, I like that.
And he would tell us that his father, Tony, told him that as a kid all the time, don't major in the minors. I think there's something really important in that, and it's focusing on the bigger things. I guess my own personal adaptation of that is to get out of the weeds and get up into the clouds, because if you let yourself get stuck in the weeds on a daily basis, focusing too much on operational stuff, and you're not up there in the clouds taking that strategic aerial approach, I think you're going to miss some opportunities.
Yeah. In
addition to, of course, just having that incredible focus on relationships in a place like Adelaide.
Yeah.
So if you think that you don't have the confidence or the ability to go out and network or engage in business development, you do. Pick up the phone, send an email, have a coffee with someone, buy someone lunch, because you never know where that relationship might take you in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years time. And if you do that, if you implement that as a rule, you're going to have a pretty big collective network by the time you leave that job and look for the next one.
Yeah. People will be knocking on your door.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I love it. Don't major into minors. That's in the minors is a big thing. Especially people in executive positions, right? If you're you've obviously hit the executive position for the simple fact that you can think strategically, you can think outside the square. You are a leader of people. Therefore, you shouldn't be delivering on the minors because you're wasting.
Get out of the weeds.
The talent.
Get up into the clouds.
Absolutely. If you had access to a time machine, I'm a big Back to the Future fan, so I had to throw this in. If you had access to a time machine, you could go anywhere.
Yeah.
But so one trip, and you forward and back, you got to come back. Where would you go?
Probably 2017 to the MCG. Before the Crows lost to Richmond would be one to try to change the course of history there. But no,
just to get be a sniper in the stand and pop
take out Jack Revolt. Yeah. Look, I would actually love to. I would love to have seen how my parents actually raised their kids, how they did it.
In the caravan?
Yeah, in the Jayco. In addition to, I lost both my grandparents on dad's side over the last 5 years. So my pop passed away just before COVID, but people like my nan and pop, they came from a really different generation with different times. They went through incredible technological change in their lifetime. They came from a farm and built this great family business. But I would have loved to have sat down at the front bar at one of those regional pubs in Queensland, New South Wales, or Victoria to have a beer with my grandfather. To have a beer with, just to sit down and get to know him a bit, a bit better at that time. I think that would have been fascinating.
Yeah.
To hop into that time machine of yours and go back to some time.
What's yours now? But
in the 70s or 80s.
It's an interesting point of view. We've had someone on the podcast before previously say that they would go back to the time where their grandparents were around 18, 19 and just hang around with them and see what they're like. I just thought that was a really great insight. It'd be such a good insight.
Yeah, well, I'm the same. Sitting in one of those pubs in, I don't know, Wollongong or Billawheeler or somewhere else after Pop had just finished on the construction site and he's covered in bloody dirt and dust.
Would they know? Would you want him to know you at that point, or would you go in as a
No.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It'd be an interesting conversation. You'd learn a lot, I reckon.
I think that's right. I mean, you might leave the pub thinking,
shit, that's not how I thought. Yeah. What happened there? What a liar! Yeah, maybe.
But I think that would be great.
Yeah,
if we could.
Brilliant. If you could have one superhero power, what would it be?
Well, my 5.5-year-old, one of his superpower abilities, Walter is his name. One of Wally's superpower abilities that he'd love to have is to be invisible and to climb buildings. But mine, look, I mean, it might be being able to see what's over the horizon, some sort of, future-focused ability to see what happens in 5 years' time.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah, whether that's from an investment
perspective. Like a walking almanac.
Well, it's a bit like Back to the Future.
Yeah, it is.
With the Chicago Cubs, I think it was.
Yeah. Oh, that's my answer. I'd go forward, buy the almanac, come back. It makes complete sense.
I think that's probably right. But there is something quite romantic about being Spider-Man or Superman flying through the clouds.
Yeah.
Getting out of the weeds and into the clouds.
Yeah, I love it. Perfect. And you are a father of 3. So you've got to have a dad joke for us.
I've got too many, and there's just they're so bad. I mean, my kids get so annoyed with me. They're 7, 5, and 2. They get so annoyed with me.
I'm laughing. I haven't even heard it yet.
Well,
as someone who actually appreciates that they are bad, it's going to be good.
Oh, look, there's probably too many. I mean, my 7.5-year-old daughter, Delilah, is just at that point in time now where she spends most of her days rolling her eyes at me. And I don't know when she became 15.
Maybe the same age.
Maybe she jumped in that time machine and went forward 8 years. I don't know. Look, there's way too many, and I don't want to entirely embarrass myself during the duration of this particular podcast to reveal many of them to you.
You got to tell me one. Come on.
I just don't have any that are springing to mind right now because I need to be in that environment with the kids and
acting a bit silly.
Yeah, just being stupid.
No, it has to be one.
So maybe what we might have to do is just chop this.
It's all good.
To speed up my response.
No stress.
Yeah.
We'll let it slide. It is a hard one to come up with on the spot, though. I should prepare people with this. You got to come to the podcast with a dad joke. I'm just one of those people that can rattle off shit jokes at a whim.
Give me some of yours.
No, I don't want to. No, why'd the koala fall out of the tree?
I don't know.
Because it was dead. That's just pretty simple. That's a shit joke, right?
That's terrible.
No, it's
good. But it's good because it's so bad.
That's what I mean. Well, that's what a dad joke is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why'd the second koala fall out of the tree? Got hit by the first one.
You're right. That's terrible.
And why'd the third koala fall out of the tree? Thought it was a game. Go home and tell your kids this one. Why'd the lizard die? got hit by 3 koalas. Anyway,
that could go on and on.
You could just keep playing with it.
Yeah.
So
No, I've got nothing.
anyway, I said it for you. Thank you very much for your time today, Daniel. It's been amazing having you. Your insight into what's happening here in South Australia and Australia is really great. It's great to hear that insight. It's not something that we hear often on an everyday basis. Good luck with everything that you are doing as well with the future, and
thanks, mate.
And the impact that you can have on South Australians. I feel is going to be great moving forward into the future. So
you're very kind, Daniel. But thank you for taking time out of your day to come here and sit down with me. This has been really good fun. It's been a really good chat.
Excellent.
I
Thanks
appreciate
again.
it.
Cheers,
Thanks, mate.
guys. Take care.